This was my life after work for the last week as I made a sanity-sapping attempt to no-hit promised consort Radahn. As time progressed, I got better, but every molecule of improvement was painfully acquired. A few days ago, I got down to winning being only hit 3 times, then only 1 time. And finally and mercifully, yesterday I got the damage-free victory. I documented this journey on my channel. Having now fought Radahn approximately 1 billion times, I'm intimately familiar with his moveset and feel like I'm in a good position to both diagnose his defects and prescribe their remedies. Let me note my own biases at the outset, though. First, when you fight a boss so many times, there tends to be a homogenization of opinion. It's always satisfying to feel like you know a fight super well, which tends, in my case, to generally lift the assessment. Second, no hitting is different than a regular playthrough. When taking some damage is fine. I'm judging having played from a no-hitting context, but I also want to argue that these thoughts are applicable to any playthrough. First, if a boss is mechanically deficient, he's mechanically deficient. End of story. Just because you can survive his deficiency doesn't make him any less so, and such shortcomings should be critiqued and excised in subsequent patches. Second, in a fight as difficult as Radahn's, the average player is going to need every flask. If there are moves that cause near unavoidable damage, the developers are essentially imposing a mandatory damage debuff without any beneficial compensation in return, which is bad. Radahn, in my opinion, though, is close to being an excellent boss. A tier for sure, perhaps even S. But there are 3 defects that vitiate this potential entirely, one far more than the others. To make a perhaps unseemly allusion to a famous Churchill line, never before has so much of a fight been so completely impacted by so few moves. A quick note to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment if you like my videos. I make a wide array of Soulsborne content from analyses like these to challenge runs and guides, and I'm grateful for any support. Anyway, let's start with all the positives. Without his demerits, Radahn would be a highly challenging fight, but ultimately doable and fair, which is appropriate for the final boss of the DLC. He has a capacious library of moves that come with a wide array of required responses. He's not a roll-only boss. In Phase 1, he utilizes a mixed tempo that requires quick thinking, moveset acclimation, and arrhythmic roll responses. I think the developers drew a lot of inspiration from Slave Knight Gale here, as both bosses have this sort of lumbering, galumping tempo that also hits with the impact of a freight train. Radahn, however, is able to mix in a series of much faster attacks, making for a much more diverse speed patterning. Radahn's first phase also offers some opportunities for non-rolling evasion. His Blood Flame attack can be strafed, although I only started doing this later in my runs and therefore can only show it here in Phase 2, but it's the same attack in Phase 1. You can run and jump his Gravity Ball attacks, although I just rolled them, but running and jumping them is an option in Phase 1 if you want to mix things up. In Phase 2, this arrhythmic mix of fast and slow carries over, but added to the mix are punishments for directional imprecision in one's evasion. We also get moves that not only offer, but essentially require non-rolling evasion. His gravity balls in this phase are not feasible to dodge roll, because they're followed by a series of clone attacks that roll catch you. Instead, running, jumping, and rolling all mix into the response to this attack, as do the clone attacks without the gravity magic. And the pillars of holy damage radiating outward, which typically follow heavy ground slam attacks, are quite visually arresting and enjoyable to see and evade. So this fight has a ton that intrinsically makes it a visual and technical spectacle. So what went wrong? Why is it so thoroughly derided? The answer simply is the triple slash, the fucking triple slash. The triple slash is a bad move on its own, but it's also so much worse than that, because the existence of this triple slash and the way it looms and lurks over this fight, ready to screw you at a moment's notice, fundamentally structures one's entire approach, at least in a damage mitigation strategy. The slash is discharged at lightning speed. It is on the very boundary of reactability. Because of this, One's inclination is to stick with dodging as a response as often as possible, because that's likely to be the response to every other sword attack in Phase 1. In other words, because dodge rolling is how one deals with most moves in Phase 1 and in Phase 2, and because the slash attack comes out so quickly, it's extremely difficult to not automatically roll in response, and in most circumstances, the triple slash is not fully rollable, which leads to insta-damage taken. The one way to avoid the slash with rolling is to stay on his extreme right and your left. This is the second major problem. The existence of the slash and the impossibility of rolling it in a neutral position force the player into a constant state of leftward motion, turning the entire fight into, as one of my subscribers artfully put it, a dodge left simulator. This greatly curtails player freedom and imposes a lamentable monotony to a fight that otherwise would invite a great deal of inventiveness, flexibility, and freedom. To add insult to injury, even this approach of leftward dodging is a band-aid at best that hardly works. His constant repositioning and the dragging effect of the camera makes staying on his left quite difficult, requiring you to actively move there, which is often impossible to do in time. It's a complete mess, a thoroughly dogshit move that has the remarkable effect of structuring and weakening the entire manner in which the fight is conducted. It's almost impressive in that extent. There are ways to deal with it without rolling, but these are subpar because of the incredible speed of the attacks and the general mechanics of the game. You can parry it, but again, because of the arrhythmic tempo of the sword attacks and because of the speed it comes out, parrying is not a particularly great response, and you also shouldn't have to parry something if you don't want to. The other option is to backstep, but that's also problematic because you have to be standing still, and for so much of this fight, you're in constant motion. So I did not find backstepping to be a particularly fair way of dealing with it, although it is an option. Finally, you can use the Sekiro tier and deflect it, which is the strategy I ultimately went with. But this is hardly any better. The attack happens so quickly that it requires a high cognitive bar to get this right. I found that if I was even slightly tired or slightly hungry, I simply didn't have the processing speed to react in time or differentiate it from other attacks. Especially because you deal with his other attacks by rolling, using deflection requires very active, deliberate overriding of normative impulses, which is a hefty burden to place on such a short window. It would be a different story in a game like Sekiro, where you're deflecting everything, but that only works in Sekiro because there is no stamina bar in that game. In Radahn's fight, you functionally cannot deflect more than 3 attacks in a row because of stamina, and many of his individual extremely heavy attacks will knock you over when you deflect them. So deflecting constantly is not a way that you can get around this issue. So without the need, imposed entirely by the triple slash, to constantly roll left, Phase 2's holy damage would strike a perfect balance between demanding situational awareness and prohibiting willy-nilly dodging and permitting a certain degree of freedom mixed with precision. It would be an intelligent, harsh, but fair use of the arena and positional strategization. With the slash, it turns into an anvil hanging from your neck. There are 2 other fixes I think should be made, but these are far, far less essential. First, the arena should be flattened. It may be aesthetically moving to see the topography of carnage ossified beneath our feet, but the mechanical nightmare this imposes is not worth the trade-off. It's very easy to trip over some jutting protrusion, or to get stuck while moving forward. This limits the viability of strafing some attacks, again, curtailing freedom of response. It can also just plain cause you to get hit when you really shouldn't because you get stuck, which is immensely frustrating. There are times when the arena can work in your favor, though. If Radahn is elevated relative to you, his triple slash can sometimes just go over your head, even at a neutral position. Unfortunately, as a general strategy, this is useless because it's impossible to force him to stay in this position, given his high degree of both aerial and ground-based mobility. So this benefit of the arena is eliminated in most cases. Third, and least importantly, the visual clutter in this multi-hit combo in Phase 2 should be attenuated. I don't find the visual clutter in most of Phase 2 to be that problematic, but this combo happens quickly, involves arrhythmic timing, and is almost impossible to see in the high adrenaline context of attempting to avoid it. It's self-parodic and absurd, demanding one to memorize a moveset to the extent of functionally doing a blind playthrough is, as I said, a self-parody of the concept of deeply learning a boss, and it bothers me from both an experiential and an ideological perspective. This, as I said, is the most cosmetic of the blemishes on this fight, and it would not be a tragedy if they left it as it is, although I think it would be a considerable improvement if it were to be fixed. Overall, so much in this fight is excellent. It's a butterfly's eyelash away from being a phenomenal conclusion to a phenomenal DLC. The Shadow of the Erdtree DLC deserves that conclusion, and so do we. It would be an ineffable disservice to all if FromSoft were not to fix it in their next patch. Let's sincerely hope they do.